The heavy oak doors of lead oil swung open, emitting a blast of cool evening air that cut through the warmth of the candlelit dining room. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the kind of hushed reverence usually reserved for libraries or art galleries. The room smelled of expensive things: truffle oil, burnt butter, and the metallic tang of fine silverware being polished by unseen hands. This was not a place for loud laughter or sloppy eating. It was a place for seeing and being seen, a fortress of high gastronomy where the price of a single entree could easily cover a week's worth of groceries for an average family. At the helm of this floating palace of food was Chef Adrian. He was a man whose reputation preceded him like a dark storm cloud. Tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually wearing a scowl that suggested he had personally been offended by the existence of every ingredient in his kitchen. Adrian was a culinary tyrant. He didn't just cook, he dictated. He viewed himself not as a service provider, but as an artist who was deigning to paint his masterpieces onto the plates of the unworthy masses. To Adrian, the customers weren't guests. They were an interruption, a necessary nuisance who funded his obsession with perfection. He demanded absolute silence from his staff and terrified his sous chefs with a voice that could boil water. On this particular Tuesday night, the restaurant was buzzing with the city's elite. Men in crisp suits and women in glittering diamonds sat at white-clothed tables, sipping wine that cost more than a used car. They were here for the experience. They were here to say they had tasted Adrian's food. Then, the atmosphere shifted. A young woman stepped up to the host's podium. She looked like a bird that had accidentally flown into a skyscraper. She was 22 years old. Though in the soft light of the chandeliers, she looked even younger. Her name was Sophie. She wore a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days and a pair of dark slacks that were practical, not fashionable. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face was scrubbed clean of any makeup. She clutched a small worn handbag against her chest as if it were a shield. In a room full of peacocks, she was a sparrow, the mater d'. A man named Pierre, who had perfected the art of looking down his nose at people, glanced up from his reservation book. His eyes swept over Sophie, taking in the lack of jewelry, the sensible shoes, and the overall aura of simplicity. His lip curled ever so slightly. "Good evening, miss," Pierre said, his voice dripping with the kind of politeness that is actually quite rude. "Do you have a reservation?" Sophie nodded quickly, her eyes darting around the room. "Yes, I do." Under the name Sophie Bennett, for 7 o'clock, Pierre raised an eyebrow as he scanned the list. It took him a long time to find her name, even though the book wasn't particularly full. He was making a point. He wanted her to feel small. "Yes." "Here it is," Pierre drawled, tapping the page with a gold pen. "A table for one." "I assume you are aware of our dress code, Miss Bennett?" Sophie felt her face flush hot. She looked down at her clothes. I thought this was okay. I'm meeting someone later, and I didn't want to be too formal." Pierre sighed, a long, suffering exhalation of breath. "Very well. We do try to accommodate everyone. Follow me, please." He led her through the maze of tables. Sophie could feel the eyes of the other diners on her. Whispers trailed in her wake like smoke. A woman in a fur coat leaned in to whisper something to her date, and they both glanced at Sophie's beige cardigan and giggled. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she didn't belong here. She knew she looked out of place, but she had promised herself she would do this. She had promised her grandmother. Pierre deposited her at a small table tucked away in a corner, almost as if he were hiding her. It was the worst table in the house, right next to the service station where waiters bustled back and forth with dirty dishes. "Your server will be with you shortly," Pierre said, and he vanished before she could thank him. Sophie sat down carefully on the plush chair, which felt too soft for her posture. She unfolded the napkin and placed it on her lap, her hands trembling slightly. She looked around the room, marveling at the opulence. The glasses were so thin they looked like they might shatter if you breathed on them wrong. The flowers on the table were perfect, not a single petal out of place then. The double doors to the kitchen swung open with a crash. All the chatter in the room seemed to dip for a second. Out walked Chef Adrian. He was inspecting the dining room. hands clasped firmly behind his back, his eyes scanning for imperfections. He moved with a predatory grace, zeroing in on a waiter whose tie was slightly crooked. Adrian straightened it with a sharp jerk, muttered something that made the waiter pale, and continued his patrol. Sophie watched him, fascinated. She didn't see a tyrant. She saw the focus. She saw the same intensity her grandfather used to have when he was baking bread at 4 a.m. A waiter approached her table. He was young and looked nervous, likely new. "Good evening, mademoiselle. Can I start you with something to drink? Perhaps sparkling water?" Sophie smiled at him, trying to be friendly. "Just tap water, please. And I have a question about the menu." The waiter looked pained. "Of course, however, Chef Adrian prefers that we recommend the tasting menu. It is a curated journey of his current vision." Sophie opened the heavy leather menu. The words were in French, followed by tiny English descriptions. Foie gras torchon, sous vide, venison, saffron emulsion. It was intimidating. It was fancy. It was exactly what she expected. "I know," Sophie said softly. "But tonight is a special occasion for me. It's my grandmother's birthday. She passed away a few months ago, but this was our favorite place to look at from the outside. We never got to eat here." The waiter's expression softened a fraction. "I am sorry for your loss," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "I know this is going to sound strange, but I don't really want the venison or the foam. I was wondering, is the chef able to make something simple? Something old-fashioned?" The waiter blinked. "Simple? Like a steak?" "Sort of," Sophie said. She hesitated, then pressed on. "I was hoping he could make a chicken pot pie, but not a fancy one. Not one with puff pastry shaped like a flower or sauce painted on the plate. Just a flaky crust, gravy, chunks of carrot and potato and chicken. The kind that sticks to your ribs." The waiter stared at her as if she had just asked to paint on the Mona Lisa. "Pot pie? Here?" "In lead oil." "Yes," Sophie said, her eyes brightening. "I have the recipe with me, actually. My grandmother wrote it down. I could give it to him. It's really good. I know he makes incredible complex food, but sometimes simple food has the most soul, you know?" The waiter looked toward the kitchen, then back at the nervous young woman in the beige cardigan. He knew exactly what the chef's reaction would be. Adrian believed that soul was a myth invented by bad cooks to hide their mistakes. "I will. Ask," the waiter said, though his voice lacked any conviction. "But I must warn you, Chef Adrian does not take requests, especially not for home cooking." "I understand," Sophie said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a folded, stained index card. "But could you just give him this? Just tell him it's for Sophie. Please." The waiter took the card gingerly, as if it were contagious, and hurried away toward the kitchen, leaving Sophie alone at her corner table. She took a deep breath, smoothing the napkin on her lap, unaware that she had just lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was chaotic but controlled. The clanging of pans, the hissing of stoves, the shouting of orders. The waiter approached the pass, where Chef Adrian was plating a delicate arrangement of scallops. "Chef," the waiter squeaked. Adrian didn't look up. "We are busy, Thomas. If the table wants water, give them water. If they want bread, give them bread. Do not bother me with trivialities. It's the woman in the corner, chef. Table 12. She asked for a substitution." Adrian's knife stopped mid-slice. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were cold, hard chips of ice. "A substitution? No one substitutes on my menu. What does she want? No salt, no butter. Is she allergic to air?" She wants you to make a chicken pot pie," Thomas whispered. "And she gave me this." Thomas placed the grimy index card on the pristine steel counter in front of the chef. Adrian looked down at the card. Then he looked up at Thomas. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. The kitchen went quiet. The line cooks stopped what they were doing, sensing the shift in the air. They knew that look. It was the look right before a volcano erupted. "A pot pie?" Adrian asked, his voice dangerously low. "In my kitchen? She comes into my restaurant, dressed like a librarian, and asks me to make peasant slop? She said it's her grandmother's recipe, chef, Thomas tried to explain, his voice shaking. Adrian picked up the index card with 2 fingers, holding it away from his body as if it smelled bad. He looked at the handwriting. He looked at the grease stains. Then he looked through the porthole window out into the dining room, his gaze locking onto the back of Sophie's head. Something inside him snapped. He had spent 30 years perfecting his craft. He had bled, sweat, and sacrificed his life to elevate food to an art form. And now this child, this amateur, thought she could waltz in and tell him how to cook. She thought her grandmother's scribbles were better than his training? "Tell the lady," Adrian said, his voice rising so the whole kitchen could hear, "that I am not a short-order cook. Tell her that we do not serve comfort food for the weak-minded." He crumpled the index card in his fist and threw it into the trash can with violent force. "But chef," Thomas stammered, "she seems really nice." Adrian ripped his apron from his waist and threw it on the counter. "Nice? I don't get paid to be nice. I get paid to be a genius. And I will not be insulted in my own house." He began to storm toward the swinging doors that led to the dining room. The staff shrank back against the walls as he passed. He was going to handle this personally. He was going to crush this ridiculous little request and send this woman back to whatever diner she crawled out of, the double kitchen. Doors didn't just open. They flew outward, bouncing off the wall hinges with a bang that cut through the ambient clink of silverware and low hum of conversation. Adrian emerged like a storm cloud ready to burst. His white chef's coat stained with the sauces of his labor, his jaw set tight enough to crack a walnut. He didn't look left or right. His eyes were locked on the corner table, on the young woman in the beige cardigan, who had dared to disrupt the sanctity of his kitchen. Sophie was nervously sipping her water, her eyes wide, watching the tall man march toward her. She didn't know it yet, but she was a deer standing in the middle of the highway. And the headlights were approaching fast. The dining room noticed immediately. It's hard not to notice a head chef leaving the kitchen in the middle of service, unless there is an emergency. Waiters froze mid-step. Diners paused with their forks halfway to their mouths. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, electric tension. People whispered behind their hands, wondering who had angered the great Adrian. Adrian reached her table and didn't speak immediately. He stood over her, casting a long shadow that swallowed her small figure. He crossed his arms, looking down at her with an expression of pure disdain. "You," he said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear clearly. "You were the one requesting the pot pie?" Sophie flinched, almost dropping her water glass. She looked up at him, her face pale, but her eyes surprisingly steady. "Yes, that's right. I asked if it was possible." Adrian let out a sharp, barking laugh that sounded more like a scoff. He turned slightly, addressing the room as if he were the host of a show and they were the audience. "Possible? You come into Lead Oil, a temple of modern cuisine, a holder of 2 Michelin stars, and you ask for what? A nursery dinner? Comfort food. Something you can heat up in a microwave for $2? Sophie felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The people at the nearest tables were staring openly now. A man in an expensive silk tie was smirking at her. The woman in the fur coat from earlier looked absolutely delighted by the spectacle. "I didn't mean to insult you," Sophie said, her voice quiet but firm. She placed her hands on the table to stop them from shaking. "I just wanted something specific. Today is important to me. Important." Adrian leaned down, placing his hands flat on her table. He invaded her personal space, looming over her. "Do you know what I do, little girl? I work 18 hours a day. I source ingredients from farmers who treat vegetables like royalty. I pair flavors that scientists study for years. And you think you can just waltz in here off the street and hand me a recipe card? It's my grandmother's recipe," she insisted, her voice gaining a little volume. She loved good food. "She taught me that good food doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be made with care. Care." Adrian stood up straight and threw his hands in the air. "I have a team of 20 people back there who care more than you can imagine. We care about precision. We care about texture. We care about chemistry. We do not care about Grandma's secret recipe with soggy bottoms and canned vegetables. He pointed a finger at her, accusing and sharp. You are an insult to this restaurant. You are an insult to the people sitting here who actually appreciate what we do. You look around, you look at that man. He gestured to the diner in the silk tie who looked startled to be dragged into it. He is eating the venison. He is tasting the passion I put into that plate. You want to turn my kitchen into a Denny's? Sophie felt a sting of tears in her eyes, but she blinked them away rapidly. She wasn't going to cry, not here, not in front of him. I don't want a Denny's, she said softly. I just wanted to remember her. I thought maybe, I don't know. I thought a chef like you might actually respect a request that means something to someone. Isn't that what cooking is supposed to be about? Making people happy? The room went dead silent. The question hung in the air like smoke. It was a simple question, but it hit Adrian like a slap in the face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he viewed as an amateur. His face turned a shade darker. Making people happy? Adrian spat the words out. I am here to challenge people. I am here to educate them. I am not here to spoon-feed them mush because they are sentimental. If you want to be happy, go buy an ice cream cone. He leaned in close again, his eyes narrowing. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to sit there, and you are going to order off my menu. Or you are going to get up, walk out that door, and never come back. We do not serve pot pies. We certainly do not serve them to people who cannot even dress themselves appropriately for dinner. Sophie looked down at her cardigan. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She felt small, and he was making sure everyone knew it. But then, she thought about the crumpled index card in the trash. She thought about her grandmother standing in a small kitchen, humming while she rolled out dough, making something magical out of nothing. Sophie realized that Adrian was loud, but he was also empty. He had the technique, but he didn't have the heart. She took a deep breath. She looked up and met his gaze directly. It was a bold move, and it surprised Adrian. You're a bully, Sophie said clearly. Her voice trembled, but the words were distinct. You have all this skill and all this talent, but you use it to make people feel small. My grandmother used to say that a person who is truly confident in their kitchen doesn't need to shout. They let the food do the talking. She paused, glancing around the room. You're shouting because you're afraid. Maybe you're afraid that a simple pot pie would taste better than your fancy foam. A collective gasp went through the room. It was the verbal equivalent of throwing a gauntlet. The diners waited, breath held, to see what the chef would do. Adrian's face turned a deep shade of red. The vein in his temple throbbed visibly. Afraid? He hissed. You think I am afraid of you? I am Adrian Vane. I have cooked for kings and presidents. I could cook a pot pie with my eyes closed that would blow your mind. Then do it, Sophie said suddenly. The challenge was out before she could stop it. Adrian froze. You said you could do it, Sophie pressed, sensing a shift in the dynamic. You're so sure that your way is better. You're so sure that fancy techniques are the only thing that matters. So, prove it. She sat back in her chair, trying to look more confident than she felt. Make the pot pie. Make it your way. Use your fancy ingredients. But if it doesn't taste like Hersif, it doesn't have that soul, then you admit that you don't know everything. The restaurant was silent enough to hear a pin drop. The waiters were practically hiding behind the service stations. The diners were mesmerized. It was a high-stakes poker game, played with food and ego in the middle of a Tuesday dinner service. Adrian stared at her. He couldn't believe the audacity. He wanted to kick her out. He wanted to have security drag her onto the street. But his ego was the size of the room. He couldn't back down from a direct challenge, especially not from a 22-year-old in a beige cardigan. If he refused, it looked like he couldn't do it. It looked like he was afraid. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across his face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that had cornered a rabbit. Fine, Adrian said, his voice dropping to a growl. You want a pot pie? You want to see what a real chef can do with your little peasant recipe? I will do it. I will make the greatest pot pie you have ever tasted." He leaned down until he was inches from her face. "But listen to me closely. If I make it, and you eat it, and you don't admit it, is the best thing you have ever put in your mouth, you leave. You pay the bill for the most expensive wine in the house, and you leave. Do we have a deal?" Sophie swallowed hard. She knew she was risking a lot of money she didn't really have. But she also knew she was right. "We have a deal," she whispered. Adrian stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair next to him. "Good. Watch and learn, little girl. Watch and learn." He turned on his heel and stormed back toward the kitchen, the fury radiating off him in waves. The doors swung shut behind him, and the room let out a collective breath. Sophie sat alone at the table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had just challenged a monster. She had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. But for the first time all night, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like she was fighting for something that mattered. Inside the kitchen, the explosion was immediate. Adrian burst through the doors, ripping his apron strings loose and grabbing a fresh one. "Thomas!" he roared, his voice echoing off the stainless steel walls. "Get me a chicken, a whole one. And get the carrots from the garden, not the cheap ones. And I need fresh thyme, rosemary, and the best butter we have." Now, the kitchen staff scrambled. They had never seen the chef like this. He was moving with manic energy, grabbing pans, firing up the burners. He was a man possessed, driven by the need to crush this girl. To prove that his genius could eclipse her memory, he pulled a fresh piece of paper from his order pad and began to sketch, his hand moving with lightning speed. He wasn't going to just cook a pot pie. He was going to deconstruct it. He was going to elevate it. He was going to use sous vide techniques for the chicken, a reduction for the gravy, and a laminated pastry so flaky it would float away. He would show her that simple was just a word for lazy. Meanwhile, Sophie sat at her table, the hum of conversation starting to pick back up around her, though the glances continued. She took a sip of water, waiting. The game was on. The kitchen was usually a place of organized chaos. It's a symphony of sizzling pans and sharp commands. But tonight it felt like a war room. Adrian moved with a terrifying intensity. He wasn't just cooking. He was attacking the ingredients. He slammed a heavy pot onto the stove, the sound ringing out like a gunshot, causing the dishwasher to drop a stack of clean spoons. "I want the chicken butchered now," Adrian barked, his voice straining. "And not into cubes. Cut it into perfect, uniform geometric shapes. If I see one jagged edge, you're going home." He grabbed a bundle of fresh thyme and rosemary, stripping the leaves off the stems with such violence that his knuckles turned white. In his mind, he wasn't making a home-cooked meal. He was building a weapon. He was going to prove to the girl in the SUV, cornered into the entire restaurant, that simple was just another word for boring. He was going to take her rustic idea and overwhelm it with technique. While the staff scrambled, Adrian turned his attention to the sauce. He didn't just make gravy, he created a reduction. He took the bones of the chicken, roasted them until they were nearly black, and then simmered them with veal stock, port wine, and a dash of truffle oil. He wanted a flavor profile so complex, so deep, that it would make Sophie's grandmother's version taste like dishwater. He checked the viscosity, dipping a spoon in and letting it coat the back of his hand. It was glossy, thick, and rich. Too rich. He muttered to himself. No, there is no such thing. Out in the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to pure entertainment. The patrons weren't just eating anymore. They were watching a show. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the kitchen doors, waiting for the main act. The waiters were walking on eggshells, refilling water glasses without a sound. Terrified that any extra noise might set the chef off again, Sophie sat quietly, ignoring the whispers. She was staring at the empty place setting in front of her. She wasn't nervous about the food anymore. She was nervous about the confrontation. She hadn't meant to make a scene. She just wanted to taste a memory. She closed her eyes for a moment and pictured her grandmother's small, cluttered kitchen. She remembered the smell of floured dust in the air, The way the old radio would crackle with country music, and the warmth of the oven against the winter chill. There was no ego in that kitchen. There was just love. Back at the pass, Adrian was plating. He decided against a traditional pie dish. Instead, he used a large, wide-rimmed bowl. He placed the sous vide chicken cooked precisely to 165 degrees, so it remained juicy at the bottom. He arranged the carrots and peas in a perfect circle. He poured the dark, glossy sauce over the top, hiding the vegetables under a veil of luxury. Then came the crust. He didn't just roll out dough. He had made a puff pastry from scratch, folding and chilling it repeatedly to create hundreds of layers of air and butter. He cut a perfect circle, scored it with an intricate lattice pattern, and placed it on top of the bowl. He aguashed it until it shined like gold. Into the oven it went. For 10 minutes, Adrian stood by the warm window watching it rise. He watched the butter bubble up through the lattice and turn a deep, golden brown. It looked perfect. It looked like a photograph in a magazine. "It's ready," he announced to the room. The entire line of cooks exhaled. Adrian picked up the bowl. It was heavy, hot, and smelled incredible. The aroma of roasted chicken, butter, and herbs drifted out, making even the most seasoned cooks swallow hard. Adrian didn't trust a waiter to deliver this. This was his message. This was his victory lap. He pushed through the swinging doors. The restaurant went silent again as he marched across the floor. He didn't look at anyone else. He locked his eyes on Sophie. He reached her table and placed the bowl down gently, but with a sense of finality. The steam rose up, curling around Sophie's face. It smelled amazing, undeniable. Even Sophie had to admit it smelled like the best thing she had ever encountered. "There," Adrian said, crossing his arms. "That is a chicken pot pie. Or rather, that is what a chicken pot pie wishes it could be." He leaned in, his voice dropping so only she and the tables immediately next to them could hear. "Eat. Tell me it's the best thing you've ever tasted. Admit that your grandmother's recipe was amateur, and then you can leave." The restaurant leaned in. Waiters stopped in their tracks. The man in the silk tie stopped chewing. It was the moment of truth. Sophie looked down at the bowl. The crust was a masterpiece of engineering. She picked up her spoon. She felt the weight of the room pressing down on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, breaking the crust. It shattered with a satisfying, flaky crunch, better than any sound she had ever heard. She scooped up a piece of chicken, some carrot, and a generous amount of the dark sauce. She lifted the spoon to her lips and took a bite. She chewed slowly. Adrian watched her face like a hawk, looking for the sign of surrender. He expected her eyes to widen in delight. He expected her to gasp. Sophie swallowed. She put the spoon down and took a sip of water. Adrian frowned. "Well?" Sophie looked up at him. Her expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't defeated either. It was thoughtful. "It's incredible," she said honestly. Adrian smirked. "I know. The crust is perfect," she continued. "It's light, it's airy, it's buttery. The chicken is tender. I can tell you cooked it perfectly. And the sauce. It's powerful. It's strong. But," Adrian asked, sensing the hesitation. The crowd held its breath. "But it's not a pot pie," Sophie said gently. "It's too much. The truffle. It fights with the thyme. The sauce is so rich, it hides the taste of the vegetables. It's impressive, absolutely, but it doesn't taste like home. It tastes like a restaurant trying too hard." The room let out a low murmur of shock. Adrian's smirk vanished. His face turned a shade of crimson that rivaled the reduction sauce. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I said it's technically perfect," Sophie said, meeting his gaze without fear. "But it has no soul. It's cold. You cook this with your head, chef, not your heart, and you can taste the difference." She pointed to the bowl. "My grandmother's crust wasn't as fancy. It was tough sometimes, but it tasted like wheat and sunshine. Her gravy wasn't reduced for hours. It was just the juices from the pan, thickened with a little flour and milk. But when you ate it, you felt safe. You felt loved." She took another bite, just to be sure, and nodded. This tastes like anger. It tastes like you were trying to win an argument. And that's not what food is for. Adrian stood frozen. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. The insult wasn't just to his cooking. It was to his identity. He had just poured his soul into this dish, using every technique he had mastered over a lifetime, and she had called it angry. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a tiny, nagging seed of doubt. Had he lost the plot? Had he become so obsessed with being the best that he had forgotten how to make food that actually made people feel something? You don't know what you're talking about, Adrian stammered, but the fire was gone from his voice. He sounded tired. Then prove me wrong, Sophie said. She saw the crack in his armor. She stood up slowly, not out of aggression, but out of respect. I can show you, or you can throw me out. But I think deep down, you know I'm right, and I think that scares you. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a copy of the recipe she had brought. If you have the courage, she said, placing the paper on the table next to the golden bowl, come back to the kitchen. Let's make it together. Not your way, not my way, but the right way. She looked at him not as a tyrant, but as a human being. Or are you afraid that a simple girl like me can teach the great Adrian something? Adrian looked at the paper. He looked at Sophie. He looked at the beautiful, complicated mess of a pie he had made. The room waited for his explosion. They waited for him to scream for security. Instead, he let out a long, shaky breath. His shoulders slumped. He looked at the floor, then back up at her. His eyes no longer cold, but confused and strangely vulnerable. The right way, he whispered, almost to himself. He looked at the kitchen doors, then at Sophie. A different kind of challenge sparked in his eyes. Not a challenge of dominance, but of discovery. He said, his voice rough. But if we do this, you listen to me about the heat, and you don't touch my knives? Sophie smiled, a genuine, warm smile that lit up her face. Deal. Adrian turned and walked toward the kitchen, but this time he didn't storm. He walked slowly, and he gestured for her to follow. The dining room erupted in whispers as the young woman in the beige cardigan stood up, smoothed her pants, and walked past the tables to follow the world's greatest chef into his domain. The game had changed completely. Asterisk the walk from the corner table to the kitchen doors. It felt like the longest journey of Sophie's life. With every step, she could feel the heavy gaze of the diners burning into her back. The silk-tied man was whispering furiously to his date, and the waiters stood frozen against the walls, their mouths slightly open. It wasn't just that a customer was entering the kitchen. It was that the customer, the girl who had publicly insulted the chef, was walking in there as if she owned the place. Adrian pushed the door open and held it for a second, just long enough for Sophie to slip through. As soon as the heavy door swung shut, the noise of the dining room vanished, replaced instantly by the roar of the kitchen. It was a different world back here. The air was hot and thick with the smell of roasting meat, garlic, and onions. It was chaotic, loud, and frantic. Pans were clanging, timers were dinging, and sous chefs were shouting orders over the sizzle of the stoves. When Adrian stepped in, however, a ripple went through the room. The line cooks looked up, expecting a tantrum, but they didn't get one. Adrian just walked to the back and grabbed a spare apron from a hook. He threw it at Sophie. She caught it awkwardly. It was heavy, stained with oil and spices, and it smelled like hard work. Put it on, Adrian said. He didn't yell. His voice was strangely calm, which was somehow more unsettling than his shouting. He moved to an empty steel prep station near the back, away from the main line, where the dinner orders were flying out. Wash your hands first. Use the brush. Sophie moved to the sink. The water was scalding hot, just the way she remembered her grandmother liking it. She scrubbed her hands with the stiff bristle brush, watching the brown suds swirl down the drain. When she turned around, Adrian was waiting. He looked massive in the small space, his arms crossed over his chest, blocking the exit. So, he said, you think my food is angry? You think I have no soul? Show me. Sophie nodded. She walked over to the prep table. She felt small amidst the industrial steel and giant mixers, but as soon as she touched the table, her posture changed. She wasn't a nervous customer anymore. She was a cook. "First," she said softly, "we need the right kind of fat. You used butter and it was good. But for this, we need bacon grease." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Bacon grease? In a cream sauce? That's heavy. That's sloppy. It's flavor." Sophie corrected him gently. "It's salty and smoky. It gives the gravy a base that butter can't provide." He stared at her for a moment, then grunted. He reached into a warmer and pulled out a jar of rendered bacon fat he used for certain sauces. He slammed it on the table. "Fine, use it." Sophie didn't let his attitude bother her. She scooped a generous dollop into a wide pan. "Next, the onions. You cut yours into perfect tiny cubes." "That's wrong." "Wrong?" Adrian scoffed. "Uniformity ensures even cooking." "That's for restaurants," Sophie said, looking him in the eye. "For this, we want them rustic. Different sizes. Some will caramelize and turn sweet. Some will stay a little firm for texture. It gives you something to bite into." She grabbed a knife. It was a chef's knife, heavy and sharp, much bigger than the paring knife she used at home. Adrian watched her grip. It wasn't the professional pinch grip he used. She held it like a hammer. He winced, expecting her to cut herself, but she didn't. She chopped the onions. They weren't pretty. They weren't geometric. But she did it with a rhythm, a steady thump-thump against the cutting board. She scraped them into the pan with the bacon fat. The smell hit the air immediately, that homey, savory scent of onions frying. She moved around the station with a quiet confidence. She asked for flour, milk, and pepper. She didn't ask for salt. She said the bacon fat was salty enough. She cooked the flour in the fat, whisking it into a roux. Talking to herself the whole time, murmuring about color and consistency, Adrian watched. He saw that she wasn't following a recipe card. She was following her nose. She was tasting, adjusting, and feeling the food. While the gravy simmered, she turned to the dough. "I saw your crust," she said. It was technical perfection, but it was too much work. It was too much ego. She dumped flour into a bowl, added shortening, and a splash of ice water. She didn't measure. She just dumped. She mixed it with her hands, her fingers diving into the white cloud of flour. "You have to be gentle with it," she said. "If you work it too much, it gets tough. It gets angry. Just like you." Adrian stiffened. The line cooks nearby froze. Sophie wasn't looking at him, focused on the dough, but the words hung there. "You handled the dough like it owes you money," she continued softly, shaping the ball of dough. "You have to handle it like it's a baby. You have to coax it." She rolled it out. It wasn't a perfect circle. It was thick in some places, thin in others. It was messy. Meanwhile, Adrian had retrieved the chicken he had prepared earlier. "Are we using the sous vide chicken?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Sophie said. "But we're not keeping it perfect," he frowned. "What do you mean?" "Break it up," she commanded. "Don't slice it. Pull it apart with your hands." Adrian stared at her. "I spent an hour carving that. Now it's going to taste better," she said. "Cut it to clean, and it feels processed. Pull it apart, and it feels real. Put the pieces in the gravy." For a second, Sophie thought he was going to explode. His jaw worked back and forth. He looked at the perfectly cooked chicken breast, then at the chaotic mess of the gravy Sophie was stirring. But then he reached out. He grabbed a handful of the meat. He pulled it. It shredded under his fingers. He tossed it into the bubbling pan. He did it again and again. A strange look came over his face. He was getting his hands dirty. He was ruining the perfect presentation. And strangely, it felt good. It felt freeing. He wasn't a sculptor anymore. He was a builder. He added the vegetables, peas, and carrots that had been roasted but not pureed. He stirred it all together. It wasn't pretty. It was a brown, bubbling, delicious-looking mess. Sophie poured the filling into a simple ceramic baking dish. She laid the ragged, thick crust over the top. She didn't brush it with egg wash to make it shine. She didn't cut fancy vents. She just stuck the tines of a fork into it a few times to let the steam out. Wait, she said, putting it into the oven. 15 minutes. Just until the top is golden. She turned to Adrian, wiping her hands on her apron. The kitchen was quiet. The orders for the main dining room were still coming in, but the staff at this station had stopped working. They were watching the chef. They were watching a master waiting for a lesson. Adrian leaned back against the steel counter. Crossing his arms, he looked tired. The arrogance that usually radiated from him had dimmed, replaced by a heavy curiosity. He looked at the oven, then at the girl. "You were very bossy for a customer," he grumbled. "We're very patient for a genius," Sophie replied with a small smile. Adrian almost smiled back. He looked down at his hands, which were still greasy from the bacon, fat, and chicken. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger, feeling the residue. It felt grounding. Usually after service, he felt drained, hollowed out by the pressure and the performance. Right now, he just felt the grease. It was real. "My grandmother," Adrian said suddenly, the words coming out slowly. "She cooked like this." Sophie looked at him, surprised. "She did?" "Yes, in the old country. We had very little. She made stew with whatever she could find. Rabbit, onions, old potatoes. I used to watch her cook, stared at the oven door, lost in the memory. I told myself I would never cook like that. I told myself I would rise above it. I would make food that looked like art so people would know we weren't poor anymore." He looked at Sophie, his defenses completely down. "I spent my whole life trying to get away from that pot pie. And tonight you dragged me right back to it. Is that a bad thing?" Sophie asked gently. Adrian shrugged. "I don't know. The smell. It's different than what I usually make. It's warmer." They stood there in silence for a few minutes, just watching the oven door. The tension of the dining room, the judgment of the elite, the ego of the chef-it, all seemed to melt away in the heat of the kitchen. It was just two people waiting for a pie. The timer dinged. Adrian didn't move to dismiss a sous chef. He reached for the oven mitts himself. He pulled the dish out. The crust was puffy and golden brown in spots, pale in others. The sauce was bubbling up through the vents, thick and rich. It wasn't the beautiful, glossy architectural masterpiece he had made earlier. It was clumsy and humble. But the smell hit the entire kitchen like a wave. It wasn't just food. It was comfort. It was safety. It was the kind of smell that made you want to sit down and call your mother. Adrian set it on the counter. He looked at Sophie. "Grab a spoon," he said. Sophie didn't wait. She grabbed a tablespoon from a nearby container, dug into the center of the dish, and blew on the steam. She handed the spoon to Adrian. He took it. The metal was hot. He looked at the spoon, then at the chaotic crew of cooks watching him, and finally at Sophie. "If this tastes like dirt," he muttered, "I'm firing everyone," Sophie said. Adrian took a bite. He closed his eyes. The crunch of the crust was heavy and substantial. The gravy coated his tongue, rich with bacon and chicken, savory and deep. The peas burst with sweetness. It wasn't complex. There was no foam, no emulsion, no hidden chemical reaction. It was just honest. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. He stood there for a long time, saying nothing. The kitchen held its breath. The line cooks stopped stirring their pots. Finally, Adrian opened his eyes. They were watery, bright. He looked at the mess in the pan, then at his own empty station where his perfect food was plated. He turned to Sophie. For the first time all night, he bowed his head. Just a nod of respect. "You win," he whispered. Asterisk, the silence in the kitchen was heavy, but it wasn't the scary kind anymore. It was a respectful silence. Adrian stood by the prep table, looking down at the ceramic dish, the spoon still in his hand. He took another bite, slower this time, closing his eyes again to really taste it. The rest of the kitchen staff was watching him, waiting for a verdict, but no one dared to speak. They were watching a transformation happen in real time. When Adrian swallowed and opened his eyes, the hardness was gone. The lines in his face seemed softer, less angry. He looked at Sophie, who was wiping her hands on her apron, looking tired but relieved. "It's good," Adrian said quietly. Then he looked up at his staff, his voice getting louder. "It's better than good. It's honest." He turned back to Sophie. "You were right about the crust. It's heavy, but it holds the sauce. It doesn't fight it. In the bacon, it gives it a backbone I usually try to achieve with wine and stock. But this is simpler, stronger." Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She smiled. "It tastes like home, doesn't it?" "It tastes like peace," Adrian admitted. He looked around his industrial kitchen with its stainless steel and expensive gadgets, and then back at the simple dish. "I think I forgot what that tasted like. I got so busy trying to be the best chef in the world that I forgot how to feed people." He didn't say anything else, but his actions spoke volumes. He walked over to the pass, the area where the finished plates go out to the dining room. He picked up a silver platter and wiped it clean with a cloth. Then he walked back to the oven and carefully, reverently, transferred the ceramic dish onto the platter. "Thomas," Adrian called out. The waiter appeared instantly, looking terrified. "Yes, chef." "Get a bottle of the Pinot Noir from the reserve list," Adrian commanded. "The good one. And 6 glasses. We are taking this to table 12. Thomas's eyes widened. "You are serving the pie, chef?" "I am serving the pie," Adrian said firmly. "And I am serving it to her. And to the people who laughed at her. They are going to eat this peasant food, and they are going to understand what real cooking is." Adrian took off his apron and threw it on the counter. He straightened his jacket. "Bring the wine, Thomas. And bring a stack of small plates. We are sharing this." He picked up the heavy platter himself. Sophie followed him, her heart pounding again. But this time it was different. She wasn't walking to the gallows. She was walking to a celebration. When they pushed through the swinging doors, the dining room fell silent. It was a different silence than before. It was a silence of anticipation. Every head turned. The man in the silk tie stopped eating his venison. The woman in the fur coat leaned forward, her opera glasses trained on the kitchen doors. Adrian marched across the room with the platter held high, leading the way like a general returning from battle, but his prize was a humble, bubbling pot pie. Thomas followed behind him, carrying the wine and the plates. They arrived at table 12. Sophie sat down, feeling a bit faint. Adrian placed the platter in the center of the table. The smell hit the surrounding tables immediately, rich, savory, and undeniably comforting. People inhaled deeply, their curiosity getting the better of their snobbery. Adrian didn't return to the kitchen. He pulled a chair up to the table. He sat down next to Sophie. This was unprecedented. The chef never sat with customers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian said, his voice projecting clearly across the room. He didn't shout, but he commanded attention. "Earlier tonight I made a mistake. I let my ego get in the way of my purpose. I thought that because I know how to make foam and emulsions, I knew everything about food." He gestured toward the pie. "This young woman reminded me that food is not about ego. It is not about complexity. It is about soul. It is about making someone feel something real." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the diners who had been laughing. "I invite you all to taste this. There is no charge. But I warn you, once you taste real food, cooked with love and not just technique, you might find my regular menu a bit lacking." He picked up a knife and cut the crust. It cracked beautifully. He scooped out a large portion and placed it on a plate, which he handed to Sophie. Then he served himself. He poured the wine into the glasses, a deep red liquid that caught the candlelight. "To Sophie," Adrian said, raising his glass, "and to her grandmother." Sophie raised her glass. "Two grandmothers everywhere," she added softly. They clinked glasses. The sound seemed to break the final spell of tension in the room. Adrian took a bite of the pie in front of everyone, savoring it. He closed his eyes and smiled a genuine, warm smile that no one in that room had ever seen before. The man in the silk tie stood up. He walked over to the table, looking sheepish. "Chef," he said, Is there enough for a taste?" Adrian looked at him, then at the pie. He nodded. Pull up a chair, Richard. There is always enough. Within minutes, the table was surrounded. The woman in the fur coat came over. The waiters finished with their duties, drifted over. They all stood around Sophie's table, eating small portions of the pot pie on white porcelain plates meant for truffle. Risotto. The room buzzed with a new kind of energy. It wasn't the hushed reverence of before. It was the noise of people connecting. People were laughing. They were talking about their own grandmothers, their own favorite meals. The silk tie was actually smiling, wiping gravy from his lip with a napkin. The barriers between the elite and the staff, between the critics and the amateurs, were dissolving in the steam from that simple dish. Sophie sat in the center of it all, watching Adrian. He was telling a story to the woman in the fur coat, gesturing with his wine glass, looking relaxed and happy. He looked like a human being instead of a machine. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed and the last of the staff had gone home, Adrian and Sophie stood by the kitchen door. "You have a gift, Sophie," Adrian said. He looked tired, but it was a good tired. "You have a palate that can't be taught in culinary school. You taste with your heart." "I just like cooking," Sophie said with a shrug. "It makes people happy." "Forgot that part," Adrian admitted. "But I think I remember it now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He scribbled a number on the back. "I can't offer you a job as a head chef. You don't have the paperwork yet. But I need a sous chef who isn't afraid to tell me when my food tastes like anger." Sophie looked at the card, stunned. "You want me to work here?" "I want you to teach me," Adrian corrected. "And maybe I can teach you a few things about knife skills. Your grip is terrible." Sophie laughed, a bright, genuine sound. "I'll think about it." "Don't think too long," Adrian smiled, opening the door for her. "The menu needs changing. I think we're going to add a grandmother special, and I'm going to need the recipe." "It's a deal," Sophie said. She walked out into the cool night air, buttoning her beige cardigan. The city lights were twinkling, and the world felt different. She had walked in feeling small and invisible, but she was leaving with her head held high. She hadn't just defended her grandmother's memory. She had reminded a genius why he started cooking in the first place. As she walked toward the subway, she looked back at the restaurant one last time. Through the glass, she could see Adrian. He wasn't shouting. He was wiping down a table, humming a quiet tune, looking for all the world like a man who had finally found his way home.